Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Virajita Singh, and I serve as Associate Vice Provost in the Office of Equity and Office for Equity and Diversity. And I'm also the co-chair of the Diversity Community of Practices Assessment Committee. I use she, her, hers pronouns. Welcome to the afternoon session of the Diversity Data Deep Dive 7. And for those of you who are joining for the first time this afternoon, thank you for making the time. We're continuing the discussions from the morning. Before we begin, I want to first acknowledge that the University of Minnesota Twin Cities is built within the traditional homelands of the Dakota people. It is important to acknowledge the peoples on whose land we live, learn, and work as we seek to improve and strengthen our relations with our local tribal nations. We also acknowledge that words are not enough. We must ensure that our institution provides support, resources, and programs that increase access to all aspects of higher education for our American Indian students, staff, faculty, and community members. So I'd like to welcome you to the afternoon session of our DDDD7, hosted by the Assessment Committee, with help from our partners, the Office for Equity and Diversity, the University of Minnesota Libraries, and the Department of Psychology. The Diversity Community of Practice is a grassroots community of faculty and staff from units across the university that meets monthly. Our purpose is to develop and leverage personal, professional, and technical expertise, effectively creating innovative strategies that ensure successful implementation of equity and diversity goals here at the University of Minnesota. We invite you to actively make connections between the panel presentations at the beginning and engage in the conversation that follows as we construct our understandings. In terms of logistics, some members of the DCoP Assessment Committee will be monitoring chat for any questions or comments that arise from all of you. And time permitting, they will do their best to bring those comments and questions to the group, but depending on volume, we may not get to all of them, so please bear with us. Please also remember to keep yourself muted until you'd like to comment or ask a question. And because this meeting is being recorded, if you'd prefer not to be recorded, please turn off your cameras and pose questions via chat. Now it's my pleasure to welcome Shanda Hunt and Amy Riegelman of the University of Minnesota Libraries for the next presentation, which is Conducting Research Through an Anti-Racism Lens, a Library's Guide. Thank you, Shanda and Amy.
Thanks for having us, everyone. We really are honored to be here. I am Shanda Hunt, and my co-presenter is Amy Riegelman. I wanted to let you all know right off the bat that you will always have access to these slides. There are a lot of useful links in here that might be helpful to you in the future. So you will be able to access those at z.umn.edu/DDDD7 libraries. So this guide that we'll be discussing today, which is found at libguides.umn.edu/anti-racism lens, was developed in response to librarians fielding multiple requests from UMN researchers looking to incorporate anti-racism into their research practices. Specifically, faculty were asking how to find Black, Indigenous, and people of color, or BIPOC, scholars who do work in their particular topic areas, with the end goal of incorporating more diverse perspectives into their research activities. As information professionals, we knew that this was not an easy task, and we began consulting with one another about strategies. Those conversations led to a list of anti-racism practices and resources that many UMN researchers might benefit from, which we then organized into the Conducting Research Through an Anti-Racism Lens library guide. This guide shares information in two important ways. First, we share strategies for locating people and information based on our expertise as librarians. Second, we have curated resources for conducting research through an anti-racism lens. There are three authors of this guide. I am the public health librarian and data curation specialist. My degree is in public health, and I was a research coordinator in the School of Public Health before transitioning to librarianship. As a librarian, my specialty areas include data management and ethics around data sharing. Amy Riegelman is a social sciences librarian working closely with psychology, educational psychology, child development, and speech language hearing sciences. Her research areas include evidence synthesis, reproducibility, and open scholarship. Sophia Myers-Kelly was a Master of Library Science intern at the Health Sciences Library. They are a chronically ill, disabled, queer, trans activist who does social justice work locally. We are information experts, not anti-racism experts. We are all white identifying, and we note at the bottom of the library guide that our perspective is that of information specialists at a large research institution within the cultural context of the United States. Ours is not the only perspective. We did invite input from all other university librarians, but not all responded. And we've incorporated suggestions from those who did, as well as feedback from a few members of the university community who reached out after discovering our guide. We had a very productive conversation about this guide with one of our fellow librarians, Alexis Logston, who is a humanities and digital scholarship librarian, about what the guide should not be. It should not be proposed as a quote unquote solution to racist practices in research. In the introduction to the guide, we attempt to emphasize the importance of doing personal anti-racism research throughout critical race theory, anti-racism readings, a look into the history of land-grant universities, and connection with subject librarians for additional resources. Another colleague of ours, Erin Aspinall, who's the interim director of the Health Sciences Library, helped us think through how to organize the information we had collected. And we settled on naming racist practices in primary research, secondary research, scholarly publishing, search algorithms, and cataloging systems, coupled with options for mitigating those practices in each section. Each section also ends with a short reading list for further learning. Today, instead of combing through every detail of the guide, we'll present one or two resources or strategies we propose from each of these 5 sections.
Hi, so I'm Amy Riegelman, as mentioned. Thanks for passing the torch to me, Shanda. I'm going to start out by talking about the section on decentering whiteness in primary research. We are often taught that Black, Indigenous, and people of color distrust science and refuse to participate in studies because they've experienced research atrocities. For example, Tuskegee, forced sterilization, and even locally with University of Minnesota and other land grants institutions doing land grabs. But this often places the blame on those communities. So folks saying, well, there's nothing we can do because they don't trust us. And this distracts from the fact that researchers have often left communities of color out of research due to white centering. So the strategies in this section of the guide are intended to decenter whiteness, think inclusively, guidance on building trust between researchers and communities of color when conducting primary research, try to mitigate this practice. And I'm also going to talk about WEIRD. WEIRD is Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And so we thought it'd be important to mention that because of many research samples being focused on societies that are weird. And also many scientists themselves, those designing the research, also come from rich, industrialized, educated, Western and democratic societies. Next slide. And so this is mostly a repeat of what I was just talking about, but in terms of how you might want to think about approaching primary research, you're going to want to think about decentering whiteness and attempting to build the trust between researchers and communities of color. Next slide. So some things to consider are evaluating your own research questions, maybe looking back at past primary research that you were involved in, and trying to make an effort to bridge cultural gaps between you as a researcher or your team and communities of color. You could think about your research question and how that was shaped, and if it prioritizes the marginalized people, and especially those most directly affected by the research. Next slide. And you could ask yourself, are members of that community involved in the creation process? Are they being compensated for their work? Are you involving these very important members of the community? And how are you seeking folks to be involved on that level or to be part of the sample? And so considering how you are reaching folks, is it through posters? Are you communicating via many different languages? How are you targeting folks? Is it online? And have you considered the digital divide, for example? So really thinking about the populations that you're targeting and understanding how to engage with those folks. Next. And also considering outcomes. So this came up in the breakout room that I was in earlier. So not only are you involving folks throughout the research design process, but also considering outcomes and follow up to the research once you have research output. And Shanda and I really, really like this toolkit. So it's called a toolkit for centering racial equity through data integration. And this guide does just that. Looks at racial equity and gives guidance on how to think about racial equity during each part of the research continuum. So planning your question, the data collection, data access, the algorithms that could be used in the statistical tools, and then reporting and dissemination. So this guide is fantastic. It has exercises and examples, and it's organized through problematic practices and then alternatively positive practices. Next slide. And each of those stages in the research continuum is presented in a table in this guide where they have these positive practices on the left and problematic practices. So we thought this guide was terrific. And even if it's rather long, but even if you just looked at the tables, I think folks would find inspiration from that work. Next slide. Okay, so next I'm going to talk about decentering whiteness and secondary research. Some of what I described in the primary research section applies to this as well, but it's more of you as a scholar reviewing the existing primary research. Secondary research involves summary, collation, synthesis, doing deep dives into the existing literature. And as a librarian, this is something like, this is our wheelhouse in terms of folks coming to us and saying they want, to back up their claims, or they want to do an exhaustive, comprehensive search and synthesis. And we're able to give folks guidance on how and where to locate such information. And so when you are approaching secondary research, you're going to want to decenter whiteness, think inclusively, and consider ways to build trust between researchers and communities of color. Next slide. And then when we think about weird in this context, you would be critically appraising the existing primary research and looking over how they are describing their sample, looking over like whether or not they used a convenience sample of 18 to 22 majority white folks in their study, or if they made extra efforts to decenter whiteness and to have a more diverse sample. You'll also want to look for ways in which the authors or researchers describe their work and their affiliated organizations, and whether or not there's any compensation. Next. And then also you could look at the backgrounds and identities of the authors. And I can say as a librarian, this is very hard to do. And folks come to us and ask, how could we diversify our syllabus, or how could we make sure that we're not only centering white folks? And I say it's very hard to do unless you're able to locate a curated list out there online of people of color in certain niche areas. This is not part of the metadata, like I'm thinking library science wise, the bibliography, or sorry, the bib record doesn't list the race of the authors. And sometimes folks aren't disclosing that. So it could be a challenge for you to identify the backgrounds and racial identities of authors. And I think I've already pretty much covered this, but you could follow that weird acronym and use it as a checklist when you're looking over the samples used in each primary study that you're citing. Next. There's also collectives, associations out there for different, sometimes population groups. And so the one that we're highlighting here is the Cite Black Women Collective, where they're giving strategies, and this is just 3 of many strategies. So they're saying they advise that you read, make an effort to read Black women's work and to integrate it into the core of your syllabus, and to acknowledge Black women's intellectual property or intellectual production. Next. Handing it back to Shanda.
The third section of the library guide focuses on acknowledging that scholarly publishing is racist. Peer review in the publication process is meant to ensure rigid methodology and low bias in what gets published, but that system is inherently flawed. Most editors are white and or from Western nations. 66 to 80% of peer reviewers are also white. And these gatekeepers control the authorship and content of scholarly journals and books, which ultimately favor white Western authors, even when those works focus on issues of race. So this section of the guide addresses the original questions we were receiving from researchers that ultimately led to this guide's creation. Like Amy mentioned, it is not yet possible to search for an author's race in literature databases. So you must use a series of other strategies to identify BIPOC scholars who are experts in your field. One way to do this is to look outside peer-reviewed literature for perspectives from marginalized voices and groups. This type of material is often referred to as gray literature. Gray literature refers to works published outside traditional methods, and the easiest way to access it is through Google or another search engine. There's no perfect solution, unfortunately, and many search strategies will be attempted before useful information is found. So patience is key. The following on this slide are a few Google search tips that will help you get to what you need faster. Keep in mind that Google itself uses biased algorithms, so searching must be specific and requires trial and error in terms of the vocabulary that you choose. If you want to do a search for housing discrimination, for example, you could type in something like marginalized voices in housing, or you can utilize Boolean operators and other search functionality as you do in a literature database. For example, grouping together marginalized or underrepresented, grouping together housing or renter, and then combining those with and in the middle. The ors and the ands are Boolean operators, and it tells the search engine how to look for information. On this slide is also a link to more Google search refinement tips that you will find helpful. You might also try using keywords of interest plus cite::org, which tells a search engine that you are looking for an organization rather than a company or a government website. Keep in mind that prior to 2003, .org was reserved for nonprofit organizations, but since then, this domain has been obtainable for other purposes, including private companies. And yet, it still is a really good shortcut to quickly reach organizational websites. Related to that last slide, we encourage researchers to utilize Google to search for BIPOC scholars through professional organization websites. Search Google for organizations that represent marginalized groups, and within those websites, search for special interest groups, experts that they're highlighting, publications, data sets, etc. For example, perusing the digital magazine available on the National Society of Black Engineers website to find leaders in that field. You might also seek out a networking organization, such as ColorCom, which is an organization for women of color in all areas of communications, including public relations, advertising, print media, broadcast, and more. To look for such groups, use a variety of terms. One might simply be research organizations run by people of color. It can be helpful to look for underrepresented speakers at conferences. One example is an interactive tool by Diversify STEM Conferences, which has compiled a list of prominent underrepresented researchers across every field of STEM and medicine. Search for biographies that are led by BIPOC nonprofits, such as SACNAS, which is SACNAS. This is an online archive of first-person stories by and about Chicano, Hispanic, and Native American scientists with advanced degrees in science. Another method for finding BIPOC scholars is through smaller, lesser-known databases. The list here is by no means exhaustive, and there are even more listed on the library guide. But it does feature a handful of indexes focused on BIPOC issues specifically, as well as a selection of local BIPOC-led news outlets that by nature feature scholars who are BIPOC. So I wanted to do a demonstration of what that might look like. So I am going to do a demonstration utilizing a local newspaper called the Minnesota Spokesman Recorder. If you've never heard of it before, it is the oldest Black-run newspaper in the Twin Cities. And we are going to take a look at this publication from a public policy perspective. So what if we are public policy researchers and we are interested in finding leaders and scholars in the area of police brutality, for example? So when I go into Minnesota Spokesman Recorder, I could start clicking around and look at archived articles. I could also use the search box and start looking for keywords of interest to me. So I did, of course, practice this ahead of time. I tried terms like public policy. I tried terms like policy alone, protesters, and I found that after all this testing, that when I typed in activists, I actually got the best results. These were the articles that were most relevant to what I was looking for as a perspective from a public policy researcher looking into policy and police reform. So if you click through all these articles, you'll see two names that keep popping up over and over again. And one of them is Nekima Levy-Armstrong, and another one is Michelle Gross. And with a little bit of checking and going back and forth, we find out that Michelle Gross is a local white woman activist, and Nekima Levy-Armstrong is a local Black woman activist. And so if you want to incorporate BIPOC voices, you might then take Nekima Levy-Armstrong and look within the library's websites for peer-reviewed articles by that person. So this is, the Health Sciences Library. This is the main library website. As a public policy professional, I would know that the database that I use is PAIS index. So I'm going to jump in there and see if I can find articles by Nekima. And when I am in a database like this, I go into advanced search so that I can tell the database that this is an author. So when I type in Nakima's name, on the right-hand side here, instead of allowing the database to look anywhere, I'm going to tell it to look for this name as an author. And when I search, I get 0 results. And that's because I'm guessing, since Nakima's last name is hyphenated, that potentially they had a different name previously. So I'm just going to take off Armstrong and search again. And I do. I find, it looks like 2 publications, but it's a duplicate. Evaluation of gang databases in Minnesota and recommendations for change. So it's policy change. 1 article, and that's not too promising. However, we have access to law databases as well. And if you had read through the Minnesota Spokesman Recorder, you would know that Nakima is a lawyer as well. So I'm going to jump into one of the law databases called Hein Online and look for additional peer-reviewed literature there. And here, this one, I'm just going to type in Nakima Levy and hit search. And here I've appeared to have hit the jackpot. Nakima Levy Pounds was her previous name. And so here I have 212 results coming up from law literature. And it looks like publications related to incarceration, marginalization on poor Black men in the US, poor women of color and children. So all of these are policy related articles that have to do with BIPOC populations, authored by a BIPOC scholar. So I just wanted to highlight and demonstrate when we talk about these types of strategies and say that it takes trial and error and you have to go back and forth and they're not perfect solutions, that is definitely the case. But what we're trying to get across is that there are strategies that can be used. And if you use a combination of them, you're likely to get to some works that you will be able to cite, both peer-reviewed probably, and from lesser known publications that could still be very useful in your scholarship. And the 4th section of the guide focuses on acknowledging that search algorithms are also racist. And algorithms, as we know, existed before the internet, but in today's world, they actually serve as a sequence of instructions to perform computation. There's evidence that algorithms, even those in academic databases, are sometimes racist. Proprietary algorithms, for example, those used by Google, are customized to users and lack transparency, making it unclear why search results vary from person to person. And for this reason alone, you may be missing important information unless you know how to search specifically for it. And so this section of the guide actually centers on academic databases and strategies for using inclusive terminology when searching on issues of race and racism. Terminology used to describe race and ethnicity have evolved over time. This variability in language can make searching comprehensively for literature on race and ethnicity difficult. If you're performing a comprehensive literature search, for example, a systematic review, a scoping review, or doing some sort of historical perspective, you must include outdated terminology in your search strategy or check to see if old terminology has been included in the database's subject headings. And other times, you will need to use terms that were common from the preferred date range of your research. So this health sciences example on this slide from Ovid Medline, that's the database, shows that older terminology from 1963 forward has been added to the new subject heading, African Americans. And so in this particular database, once we read the definition of our subject heading, we know that we don't have to use outdated terminology. Searching for literature about racism requires a sophisticated search strategy to not only include racism, but also biases and discrimination against specific races and ethnicities. The example here is a search strategy for racism in Ovid Medline. It uses both mesh terms, meshes the subject heading in Medline, and keywords for racism, and also mesh terms and keywords for bias, discrimination, stigma, stereotyping, and prejudice, grouped with, again, mesh terms and keywords for specific races and ethnicities. Remember that terms evolve. For example, BIPOC and BBIPOC, if you've never heard of that, that's Black, Brown, Indigenous, and people of color, should probably be added to this racism search, which was only constructed a year ago. I know that sounds complicated, but of course, your subject librarians are always here to help you construct thoughtful and inclusive search strategies in databases that you utilize for your scholarship.
Okay, thank you, Shanda. So next, this section is taking a look inwards at library science. And I just want to share before I launch into talking about library cataloging systems being racist, that the library and information science field employs librarians and library workers in an array of different positions. And so some of us are focused on research and scholarship, and others are involved in very important work like maintaining our collections and preservation. And then there's the folks that do very important work of cataloging. And I'm not one of those librarians, and neither is Shanda, but it's widely known that cataloging systems are rooted in racism. And there are different cataloging systems, such as the Library of Congress system, which is what we use here for the majority of our collection, library collection. But you've probably heard of the Dewey Decimal System, which is used by a lot of public libraries. And the cataloging systems have problematic terms. And so that's demonstrated on this slide. So two examples would be languages and anti-immigrant terms. So with the classifications for various languages, it is very favoritive to Western languages and ends up grouping all of the other languages in this weird category called artificial languages, which is strange. And so this can kind of give you an idea of like the thought process that was happening when these systems were created, very white-centered. The other example here in terms of anti-immigrant terms, there's some problematic language in cataloging, such as a category for illegal aliens. And there's been a push by many groups, including American Library Association, and a really admirable group, grassroots effort from Dartmouth students moving to get the Library of Congress to change these terms. And they have given some suggestive language, such as undocumented immigrants, unauthorized immigration, unauthorized immigrants, and non-citizens. So let's go to the next slide. I have a timeline. There we go. So these changes were presented to the Library of Congress in 2014, and the Library of Congress was disappointingly dismissive of these suggestions. But then there seemed to be a change around 2016 where the Library of Congress said that they were going to make some changes. But this incited a lot of outrage, especially from Republican lawmakers in Congress. And there was, you could find a lot of like media portrayals out there, interviews that are still available with lawmakers really upset that we would remove the terms illegal alien from the library cataloging systems. And it ended up that they were even going to include language in an appropriations bill saying that, you know, making it very, very difficult for classifications to be changed. And so the Library of Congress ended up tabling this whole thing. And so the language still exists in the catalog. I have just listed the US Citizenship Act of 2021. It is, I believe it's still a bill. I should really know every detail about this, but I just included it here because I do think that there is some hope in terms of us confronting different language. That was, I've been told, part of the language in this US Citizenship Act to get folks to thinking about different terms that should be used or more appropriate. And so I think there's maybe some hope that we could work with the Library of Congress more to get these terms changed. And I do want to recommend this film that's free to view online. It's called Change the Subject. And this is the story behind the Dartmouth students approaching the Library of Congress and pushing for and advocating for these changes and what ended up resulting in terms of the pushback from lawmakers. Next.
Okay, so now we want to, we've summarized the basics of the guide for you with some, and highlighted a couple of the recommendations that we make throughout the guide. But we want to transition right now and pivot to talk about using this library guide as a teaching tool. And we're going to highlight two possible assignments. So the toolkit for centering racial equity throughout data integration. That is from the section of the guide titled Decenter Whiteness in Primary Research. This was a huge inspiration for the development of this guide. And we believe it has nearly endless uses for the classroom. We imagined this particular activity for the College of Design for a presentation we gave during Research Ethics Week. So first, we provided some historical context for the newly released redesign and rebranding of Aunt Jemima syrup, now Pearl Milling Company syrup, an example which we saw presented by Dr. Teresa Moses at the College of Design Research Showcase. So the history behind this is that in 1889, Chris Rutt, a newspaper editorial writer, and Charles Underwood of the Pearl Milling Company created a pancake mix company and named it Aunt Jemima after a mammy archetype portrayed in a vaudeville performance that they saw together. They sold the company and name to R.T. Davis Milling Company, where the owners used the image as a marketing tool and hired formerly enslaved Nancy Green to portray the Aunt Jemima character at public demonstrations. We then asked our participants to answer these 4 questions, which are based on the planning section of the toolkit for centering racial equity throughout data integration. We were hoping that participants would engage in a dialogue about performative anti-racism actions versus a genuine and well-planned rebranding, particularly given that they changed the racist name of the syrup to the name of the company owned by a man who hired a formerly enslaved woman to embody this Aunt Jemima archetype. Which, by the way, our participants that day, most of them did have great conversations around that and referred to the rebranding as lazy, which was a good description. And finally, we directed participants to problematic and positive practices table on page 16 of that toolkit to answer this very last question. What problematic planning processes were likely employed and how could the company have utilized better practices? We encourage them to think about stakeholder data collection, rushing through the rebranding process, and relying on outdated information. Another assignment was inspired by the Journals Online project, which is aimed at providing increased visibility, accessibility, and quality of peer-reviewed journals published in developing countries, so that research outputs produced in these countries can be found, shared, and used more effectively. It was launched in response to voices not heard, wasted talent, and unused research. And the link to the journal's online project is in the Decenter Whiteness in Secondary Research section of our guide. So a potential public health assignment might be an annotated bibliography based on articles found via the journal's online project. The annotated bibliography link on this slide, by the way, is an 8-minute tutorial that I created for a class. And feel free to use that tutorial in your classroom if you decide it's appropriate. Students might then write a 1-minute reflection paper on how this literature enhances their knowledge of the topic as compared to articles that they found in Western journals. The Conducting Research Through an Anti-Racism Lens library guide will always be a work in progress. In future iterations, we hope to add sections on open access publishing, which can break down barriers for community members and practitioners who cannot access publications that will ultimately benefit them. We were recently asked to help someone locate journals and publishers who are dedicated to anti-racism, as they wanted to align their research ethics with where they publish their work. And we think this could be a valuable addition to the guide as well. Another section we hope to add will be about creating and finding data. And lastly, we'd like to add a second page to the guide highlighting curriculum examples. So if you do end up using the guide in your classroom, we would love to hear from you in the future. We may even change the title of this guide based on a talk Amy viewed by Dr. Amanda Sullivan from the Educational Psychology Department, who presented recently at Decolonizing Psychology. When talking about anti-racism efforts, she prefers the term scholarship instead of research because it encompasses other important work not necessarily considered research, such as discovery, theorization, integration, application, engagement, etc. So we will continue to think about ways to improve and build upon the guide. So next, we are open to taking your questions. We'd love to hear from you.
Thank you, Shanda and Amy. There's already been a few questions coming in. So I'm going to start with Jennifer's question here. How are databases racist when searching non-racism topics? For example, searching climate change.
So I'm thinking about this in terms of the algorithm question. So Google, for example, and Google Scholar are proprietary algorithms or have proprietary algorithms. So there's a lot of confusion over how the results are ranked. Whereas library databases also have proprietary algorithms, but you're able to sort in different ways and manipulate the search results in different ways using the Boolean operators that Shanda talked about. I think the question bleeds into scholarly publishing broadly and the white gatekeepers that are controlling what gets published and therefore what would be indexed in those databases. So with your question, I guess I would encourage folks to think about like the gray literature. That's stuff that's not even hitting the scholarly publishing. And also when you're searching a database, to do some investigation over the authors themselves. That information isn't usually going to be listed in the abstract or other parts of that bib record. You'd probably have to exit the database and look online to see how the authors identify. But that's a tough question.
Thank you. Another question is from Dan. I'm really interested in how faculty, students, and staff can help to bring these tools and an anti-racism lens into subject guides associated with topics, majors, departments, and courses? Is this something that is or could be a priority for university libraries, and that could be shared labor with the subject librarians?
Shanda, do you want to take this in terms of the functionality of the LibGuides and being able to?
Well, I think that if you're using Canvas for your course, there's the ability to link to or create a library section where you can kind of curate libraries resources within your Canvas course. And so this guide could be linked as well as the contact information for your subject librarian. We also have the ability to create customized library pages for specific classes. So there are a lot of different options there for incorporating this type of work. We could also, I think we'd be happy to work with any educator in dreaming up, imagining various assignments around using aspects of this guide and tailoring them to your discipline. The College of Design exercise that we came up with was definitely outside of our wheelhouse as health and social scientists. But it was really fun and educational for us to kind of dive into the world of design and then think about how to apply our guide in a world that's very different than our own.
Right. If I can just add, because I attended that session, what was really interesting was you mentioned the comment about lazy design, but we also talked about like how ambiguous the design was, so that it could play to those who feel like change is being made, or it could play to the ones who want to stick with and don't care about racism. So, as for the design community, it was really informative to kind of get deeper into the implications. So thank you for that. There's another related question from Jennifer about the library guide and the editions and what the time frame for the editions that you mentioned are.
So the library guide was, I think we released it in January. It was we were working on it for a few months leading up to that point. And it already has, I think last time I checked, it was over 4,000 views in a pretty short time. And yeah, so we have ideas of different things that could and should be added. The guide is already pretty long to scroll through. And so like, I'm conflicted between like, what's appropriate to share on a single page versus like all the content we need to get on there and think is valuable. As Shanda mentioned, it's a living guide and we need to change terms, dependent on what's going on at the time and reconsider sections. In terms of a timeline, I think Shanda and I are both pretty interested in getting this data section up and running. Would you agree, Shanda?
Yeah. Absolutely.
So I think timeline wise that should take a priority, but I think it's TBD and somewhat life dependent when we get those things going, as my children are home with me for COVID quarantine reasons right now. Like it's just hard to get anything done. So we have really good ideas that we want to make happen, but we'll see when it actually happens.
Thank you. There's some appreciative comments here from Emilius about great presentation, particularly how racism can impact searching for information and cataloging. And Vic says, I really appreciate the usability approach to this work. I have a question for you. I'm thinking about the best way. I mean, so the 4,000 views sounds fabulous, so people are accessing it. I guess the question I have is that how best to kind of get our research one institution, that's really complex and decentralized, to kind of make it a priority. I know that I'm bringing it to the center for that I'm affiliated with, maybe doing a sort of specific session that looks at our research and how we're using it. So that is going to be my attempt to do so. And I wondered if there was ways to access you both or others in the libraries. So that's one part, like how do we kind of make lots more people engage with it. But the other thing is that how do we approach resistance? Because the reason that these systems have been in place is because there wasn't an interest, or in fact, there was an opposite interest in that. And we still have that in our institutions, right? So we have people who are really interested in making this change happen at a very fast pace. We have others who are neutral, and there are some others that who would rather not see that change happen. So do you have any suggestions for us from a institutional standpoint around this?
I'll take the first part of the question. So we are also presenting, we've presented on this guide a couple of times now. We've been invited to a number of different departments. We are also presenting at the Best Practices in Health Sciences Education Day coming up. And it's been pretty widely advertised. I actually think the number of people who have accessed it is double that. It's 8,000 at this point. Yeah, which is crazy. So in terms of folks engaging with it, I think that exactly the example you gave is wonderful. Bringing it to a center that you work with. I know that a nursing faculty who came across it decided to take it to a faculty meeting so that they could discuss amongst themselves what aspects of the guide that they would actually be able to incorporate into their work. And in addition to consulting with Amy and I, your subject librarians are familiar with this guide, have seen it. And I won't go into the back end details of it, but the guide is created so that they can pluck out the information that they think is useful for the disciplines that they serve. So you could always connect with your subject librarians and say, hey, this is a great guide, but maybe it's not super applicable to arts and humanities. And maybe we can all work together to come up with another version of the guide that is maybe more tailored towards a humanities spin, etc. So we're always open to ideas.
I think I'll also add that both Shanda and I are on systematic review teams where we support researchers in our disciplines who want to synthesize many different primary resources. And through that work, I've become more acquainted with critical appraisal. So it's a requirement of systematic reviews that you use a critical appraisal tool to look deeply at these primary studies in a way that I hadn't done previously, and to critique certain things and sometimes score them on a rubric. And so one of the things that I've been thinking about in terms of anti-racist research, specifically decentering whiteness in primary research, is what a critical appraisal tool like that would look like, or even without a tool like that, how can we communicate with our scholars that we support that they could be assessing research in this way? Yeah, and just approaching things with a more critical lens in general. So that was more of a big picture thing that I've been thinking about, maybe not a direct answer to a question.
I have a comment, or I don't know, an idea. This is awesome first. I want to say that it's awesome that you guys are providing this, very helpful. My idea is a lot of the people who are searching, trying to find BIPOC people, some of them will find out information about that. Do you have a method to get back that feedback? Because that will help, adding that information about BIPOC to the products you have, because I know the resources at the library might be limited for searching for everyone, but if people using this do the Google search, do the other search, and find out that those are BIPOC, maybe they can send back that feedback. and help with the catalog of BIPOC authors. And it's just something that I'm thinking you might be doing that already, but that was an idea.
So cataloging, I hate to even speak about cataloging because it's not my everyday work, but it's kind of a bureaucratic system. So like inserting a field to display somebody's race would be like very complicated. Like I'm thinking years and years of work and convincing folks to do that. And then, I mean, you just have, there's just so many things to consider with folks, whether or not they want to disclose their race. It's really up to the authors to do that. And universities often, feature the scholars who are publishing, but I know like sometimes it's really hard to find an author. They could have changed their name, Shanda's example. And so it can be really challenging to figure out somebody's race or even gender at times.
Thanks for that. There's one more question, and Ben, thank you for acknowledging that point I was trying to make. Jennifer, says, any info links for researchers to bring in critique of weird when we are peer reviewing articles and providing editors feedback?
Yeah, so in the guide, we have several links to articles about weird, including critiques of weird. So for example, folks say, like, instead of saying weird, just say Black. Like the studies are very white, so stop skirting around the issue and saying weird when you actually mean studies are too white. So I would definitely recommend reading through those resources. I think pushing back during peer review is really dependent on how comfortable you are and like power dynamics. So in some disciplines, it's a very masked process where they don't know you and you don't know them. And so you might feel more comfortable pushing back on those things. If it's an instance where your identity is available to them, then that could be complicated. And so, yeah, it's a really good question that I'd have to think through and then apply to each journal, whether or not it's masking your identity.
I have a question of where you see this work going next. Maybe you have plans as well.
So our next steps for the guide, is that what you mean, Virajita?
Yeah, for the guide and perhaps anti-racist approaches to research, in general, in our institution, and maybe there's national efforts happening too.
That's a loaded question.
Okay, sorry.
No, I think, in terms of the guide itself, we definitely have some next steps that we would like to take with it and areas for growth in the guide. And I think a huge part of that is future publishing practices of the scholarship that's coming out of the University of Minnesota. So I briefly mentioned open access publishing, and one barrier to that is cost. So when we publish in open access journals with open access publishers, there's article processing fees, and that usually is something that the author has to pay themselves. Well, is there an institutional approach that we could take? And the library consistently looks into ways to do this. We just negotiated some contracts in order to get waived article processing fees for our authors with a couple of journals and publishers, which has been helpful. But it's a long road, it's an uphill battle. But the significance of it is that then the communities of color that we're researching and the people of color who are comprising our samples have access to the work that is being done with them. I think that has been historically a huge complaint about land grab universities is conducting research with Indigenous and surrounding communities, and then the surrounding communities don't really see the benefits, and the end results never come full circle. And this would be one way, one step in doing that, would giving them full access to all the publications and the research outputs that come out of that.
Thank you so much for that. I was part of the first open access journal that the library put together or hosted, the Interdisciplinary Journal of Partnership Studies, and another diversity community of practice member, Teddy Potter, is also on the board and actively working on that. And that has opened access because we also invite community voices, and we have downloads from across the globe, and it's been incredible. And that was a library's effort. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. I see we're at 2:01, so I'm going to wrap up for the sake of time. But thank you so much for an excellent presentation, and thank you for your work. And we hope to see it expand and grow. And certainly, hopefully, our audience today will bring it to their networks and units to try to implement it. We're going to take a 15-minute break, and then we'll have our next session. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.